The storm howled through the streets, blanketing everything in white. Somewhere, lost in the freezing cold, a tiny kitten curled into a tight ball beneath a broken fence, her tiny body barely moving. She had been left behind, forgotten. Her small, frozen paws twitched as she let out a weak, hopeless meow. Then, in the distance, through the thick sheets of snow, came a small, limping figure. A stray puppy. His ears were covered in frost, his body weak, yet his eyes held something, the will to fight. And when their paths crossed, what happened next will leave you speechless. Like, share and subscribe, and tell us which country you're watching from in the comments. The storm had come without mercy. Winds howled like ghosts in agony, twisting through the empty streets, lifting loose snow into swirling, blinding sheets of white. The city, once alive with movement and noise, had fallen silent beneath winter's cruel grasp. Streetlights flickered dimly under layers of frost, their glow barely piercing through the endless snowfall. Cars sat frozen in place, their roofs buried beneath thick mounds of ice. Windows, once warm with the golden glow of life, were now cold and dark, abandoned by those who had fled before the blizzard hit with its full force. The storm had no pity, not for the people who had rushed to evacuate, not for the homes left behind, and certainly not for the smallest, most helpless creatures caught in its wrath. Beneath a broken wooden fence, in a tiny pocket of space barely shielded from the relentless storm, a fragile form curled into a trembling ball. Kitten. She was no older than a few months, her fur a delicate mix of white and gray, now stiff with ice. Her tiny paws twitched as she tried to move, but the cold had seeped deep into her bones. Every breath she took was shallow, her tiny ribs barely rising beneath her thin coat. Her eyes, which had once been bright and filled with curiosity, were now dull, half-lidded as exhaustion gripped her small body. She had been left behind. She didn't know why, only that one moment, she had been warm, nestled in her owner's lap, and the next, the world had become a terrifying blur of loud voices, rushing feet, and a door slamming shut without her. She had darted after them, confused, desperate to follow, but the world beyond had been too vast, too cold. The wind had pushed her back, the snow had swallowed her tiny paws, and soon, the people she loved had disappeared without a trace. She had waited. At first, she had sat by the door, scratching at the frozen wood, mewing as loudly as she could. Someone would come back. They had to. But as the hours passed and the cold crept deeper into her body, reality had begun to settle in. They weren't coming back. Still, she had tried. She had wandered the streets, her tiny paws sinking into the deep snow, her whiskers covered in frost. She had tried to find warmth, mewing weakly at locked doors, pressing her tiny body against frozen steps, but there had been no answer. Every shadow, every gust of wind, had been a new threat. She had dodged moving cars, barely making it across the street as tires skidded over the icy roads. She had seen other creatures, bigger, stronger strays who had eyed her with either pity or hunger. She had finally crawled beneath this fence hours ago. Maybe longer. Time had lost meaning in the cold. Her tail curled tightly around her body, her frozen whiskers barely twitching. She wanted to sleep. Her mother had always told her that sleep meant safety. When the world was too scary, when she felt alone, sleep was an escape. But now, a strange darkness was creeping in, heavier than before. It pressed against her mind, lulling her with whispers of rest, promising her that she wouldn't have to feel the cold if she just let go. Her tiny body gave a violent shiver. She barely had the strength to move anymore. Her paws, once so quick and playful, felt like weights attached to her body. Her tail had long gone numb. The only thing she could feel now was the relentless, aching cold. Somewhere in the distance, a loud cracking sound echoed through the night, maybe a tree branch snapping under the weight of the ice. The kitten barely twitched. She let out a weak, hopeless meow. The sound was swallowed by the wind. Snowflakes continued to fall, piling higher, creeping over her tiny form. She closed her eyes. The once busy town now lay frozen, a ghost of itself beneath winter's merciless grip. There had been warnings, news alerts, frantic phone calls, rushed evacuations. But even the most prepared had underestimated the storm's fury. Now the streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of movement. Loose debris rolling with the wind, the distant shadow of a bird flying desperately in search of shelter. There were no footprints in the snow, no tire tracks, no sign that life had existed here just days ago. Near the outskirts of the city, an old gas station stood, its rusting sign swinging violently in the wind. The door had been left ajar, ice creeping in through the cracks. Inside, empty shelves sat abandoned, their contents long gone, taken by those who had fled. A single newspaper, half buried in snow, flapped weakly against the pavement. The headline, barely visible beneath the frost, read, "Blizzard of the Century. City evacuates ahead of record-breaking storm." The date was yesterday. Not everyone had made it out in time. Not everyone had a place to go. And somewhere, beneath the weight of the falling snow, a tiny heartbeat still struggled to keep going. The kitten's breathing slowed. Her ears, once twitching at the sounds of the world around her, had gone still. The last bit of warmth in her tiny body was slipping away, replaced by a numbness that felt almost peaceful. This wasn't so bad, was it? The cold didn't hurt anymore. She could finally rest. Then, a sound, faint barely there. A crunching noise, distant but growing closer. The kitten's ears twitched. She was too weak to lift her head, but somewhere, deep in the fog of exhaustion, she knew something was coming. The wind howled louder, drowning out the approaching footsteps. But they were steady, determined. They moved through the snow with purpose, pushing forward despite the brutal cold. Then, just as the last bit of strength faded from her small body, a shadow loomed over her. A warm breath, heavy with exhaustion but alive, puffed against her frozen fur. A whimper. The kitten, barely conscious, felt something nudge her side. Once, twice, a soft whine, filled with something almost like concern. Through the thick haze of cold, she felt something press against her warm, solid breathing. A body much larger than hers. A nose nudged her again, more insistent this time. A paw, heavier but careful, rested near her tiny frame, brushing against her. Then, before the darkness could claim her, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Warmth. The sound of breathing, not her own. A presence beside her, refusing to leave. She wasn't alone. And somewhere, deep inside her fragile little body, her heartbeat, weak but stubborn, thudded once more. The storm had swallowed the town whole. Where once there had been voices, laughter, and the hum of cars moving through the streets, now there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, unnatural, pressing against the world like an unseen force. The blizzard had come swiftly, and with it the people had fled, leaving behind a city frozen in time. But not everyone had left. A golden-furred puppy trudged through the snow, his small body trembling with every step. He had been alone for days, maybe longer. Time didn't make sense anymore. His paws, once soft and padded, were now cracked from the ice, and each movement sent sharp pains through his limbs. His stomach ached, twisting painfully, demanding food that he didn't have. Still, he refused to stop. Somewhere deep inside him, there was a voice, a memory perhaps, telling him to keep going, to survive. He hadn't always been alone. Once there had been warmth, a home, a soft bed where he could curl up, safe from the world outside. There had been hands that scratched behind his ears, voices that spoke to him in gentle tones. Then, suddenly, everything had changed. The voices had grown frantic. The air had turned cold. He had watched as bags were packed, as doors slammed open and shut. The people he had known, his family, had rushed out into the storm. He had tried to follow, had barked and whined at the door, but no one had come back for him. First, he had waited. He had curled up near the door, ears perked, tail wagging slightly every time the wind rattled the walls, hoping, praying, that they would return. But they hadn't. Eventually, hunger had driven him outside. The cold had hit him like a wall, stealing his breath, biting at his paws. He had searching for food, for shelter, for the family that had once held him close. He had found nothing. Now the storm howled around him, the snow swallowing his small form as he forced his legs to keep moving. He had long since stopped barking. No one was left to hear him. Then, through the thick haze of snow, something caught his eye. A shape, small, still. His ears perked up. His first instinct was hope. Was it someone? Had he finally found another survivor? But as he stumbled closer, his weak legs shaking beneath him, his hope turned to dread. It was a kitten. The puppy stood over the tiny, lifeless body, his breath puffing out in short, desperate gasps. She was barely visible beneath the snow, her fur matted with frost. Her whiskers, stiff with ice, didn't twitch. Her tiny paws, curled inward, didn't move. For a long moment he just stared. Then, with a quiet whimper, he lowered his head and sniffed her. Cold. Too cold. The scent of life, the warm, familiar smell of another living creature, was faint, nearly gone. But not completely. A tiny, almost imperceptible puff of air escaped from her nose. She was alive. Barely. Something deep inside the puppy stirred. A feeling he couldn't quite understand. A need. A responsibility. He had been alone for so long. And now, here was someone even weaker than him. Someone who had no chance. A shiver ran through his small body, but he ignored it. Instead, he lowered himself carefully onto the snow beside her, pressing his golden fur against her frozen form. He curled around her, his small body blocking the worst of the wind. She didn't react. For a moment he feared he was too late. Then, tiny twitch. The kitten gave the faintest movement, a barely there shift in her paw, and let out a weak, broken sound. So quiet it was almost lost in the storm. The puppy's tail gave the smallest wag. She was still fighting. And so would he. The night stretched on, endless and merciless. The puppy stayed curled around the kitten, his body shaking with cold, but he didn't move away. He could hear the wind howling, rattling the buildings around them, but he didn't care. He had made a decision. He wasn't leaving her. By the time the first hint of morning light tried to break through the thick clouds, the storm had lessened, just slightly. The wind wasn't as fierce. The snowfall had slowed, but the world was still frozen. The kitten gave the faintest whimper, her tiny body pressing slightly closer to his warmth. It wasn't enough. She wouldn't last much longer. The puppy knew what he had to do. With great effort, he pushed himself onto shaky legs, his muscles protesting. The world swayed, his vision going dark for a moment as hunger and exhaustion nearly pulled him down. But he shook it off. Lowering his head, he gently took the kitten's scruff in his mouth. Her body was light, too light. She didn't stir. He had to find shelter. The storm may have calmed, but the cold was still deadly. He didn't know where to go, only that staying here meant death. So he started walking. Each step was slow, his paws sinking deep into the snow. His breath came in ragged puffs, his body screaming for rest, but he ignored it. He carried the kitten through the silent, abandoned city, past cars frozen in place, past buildings covered in thick layers of ice, past street signs buried in snow, their words unreadable. Time lost meaning. He just walked, and walked, and walked. Then, a scent. Faint but real. Smoke. Not the dangerous kind, not the burning kind, but the kind that meant warmth. That meant people. The puppy's ears perked. He pushed forward, legs trembling beneath him, following the scent with everything he had left. Then, through the haze of white, he saw it. A small house. The windows were dark, covered in frost, but there, just barely visible, was a trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was inside. He forced his legs to move faster, almost stumbling as he reached the door. He gently set the kitten down onto the porch. Then, with the last bit of strength he had, he lifted his paw and scratched weakly at the wood. Nothing. He let out a small, desperate whimper. Still nothing. He barked. Just once, his voice weak but insistent. Then, a sound. Footsteps. The door creaked open. A wave of warmth spilled out, melting the frost on the wooden steps. A figure stood in the doorway. A person, bundled in thick clothes, their face barely visible beneath a heavy scarf. They stared for a long moment, taking in the sight before them. A golden-furred puppy, trembling, half buried in snow. A tiny kitten, barely breathing beside him. Then, without hesitation, they moved. A pair of warm hands scooped up the kitten, pressing her carefully against their chest. Another set reached for the puppy, lifting him into the warmth. Soft words, filled with something he hadn't heard in what felt like forever kindness. The puppy let out a weak sigh. As the door shut behind them, closing out the cold, he felt the warmth seep into his frozen body. For the first time in days, he felt safe. He had done it. They had survived. The puppy stood over the small, unmoving figure in the snow, his golden fur matted with ice, his thin body trembling from exhaustion. The storm raged around him, howling winds whipping against his frail frame, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the tiny kitten, half buried in the snow, her body still, her fur dusted in frost. She looked like she had been there for a while, too long to still be alive. His instinct told him to keep moving. He had been wandering the frozen streets for days, his stomach twisted with hunger, his paws numb from the cold. Every step was a battle against the snow that swallowed his legs, against the freezing wind that cut through his thin coat like knives. He had survived by keeping his head down, by pushing forward, by not stopping for anything. Survival meant moving. Slowing down meant death. And yet, he hesitated. His breath came out in short, shaky bursts, curling into the air like fading wisps of warmth. His ears twitched as he watched the kitten's tiny body, waiting for any sign of life. His own survival was uncertain. How could he help another? The storm had already claimed so much. The rational thing, the safe thing, was to keep walking. But something in him wouldn't let him. A soft whimper escaped his throat. He nudged the kitten gently with his nose. No movement. He tried again, pressing his cold snout into her fur. Still nothing. His heart pounded. Was she already gone? He let out a low, mournful whine, circling her small form, his paws sinking into the deep snow. The blizzard howled louder, as if urging him to leave her behind, to keep going before he, too, became just another lifeless shape buried under ice. But he couldn't walk away. His chest ached with something more than the cold, something deeper, something he didn't understand. He nudged her again, harder this time, pushing at her tiny body with his nose. And then a sound, faint, barely there. A tiny, pitiful meow, so weak it was almost lost in the wind. His ears perked up. She was alive. A new kind of urgency filled him. He whined again, circling her, nudging her with more force. Her tiny body twitched, a small, shuddering breath escaping her. But she was too weak to move, too frozen to lift herself from the snow. If he left her here, she wouldn't survive. His body screamed for rest, for warmth, for food. His legs threatened to collapse beneath him. He knew he had no strength left. But the kitten, she had even less. He looked around. There was nothing but endless white, swirling snow, frozen streets stretching into the distance. No shelter, no warmth, no safety. If he carried her, where would he even go? The logical part of him knew this was a mistake. He could barely walk as it was. He was small, weak, starving. He wasn't strong enough to protect himself, let alone another helpless creature. The safest thing to do was leave her. But the thought of walking away felt unbearable. With a deep, shaky breath, he bent down, gently gripping the kitten's scruff between his teeth. She was light, too light. He could feel every bone beneath her icy fur, her tiny body limp against his mouth. She didn't fight, didn't make a sound, just hung there, fragile and helpless. The puppy took a step forward, his legs wobbling under the weight of exhaustion. The snow was thick, making every movement feel like dragging himself through quicksand. The wind battered against him, stinging his eyes, making his steps unsteady. But he forced himself forward. One step, then another. His body protested, muscles aching, paws burning from the cold. He had nothing left to give, no energy, no warmth. But he kept walking. The kitten didn't move, didn't make a sound. He could barely hear her breathing, could only hope she was still alive. The storm grew worse, the wind screaming in his ears, the snow blinding him. He had no idea where he was going. There was no destination, no shelter in sight, only endless cold, stretching as far as he could see. But turning back wasn't an option. His paws sank deep with every step, his small body barely making progress. But he didn't stop. Every muscle in his body begged him to rest, to lie down, to let the cold take over. It would be easy. The snow was soft, inviting. The exhaustion was so deep it felt impossible to fight. But the tiny weight in his mouth reminded him why he couldn't give in. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. The blizzard screamed around him, but the puppy kept moving, carrying the kitten through the frozen wasteland, refusing to let her go. The kitten barely weighed anything, her fragile body dangling from his mouth like a scrap of cloth. Yet to the puppy, she felt unbearably heavy, not in weight but in responsibility. Every step forward was a battle against the snow that swallowed his legs, against the wind that howled and tore at his fur, against the exhaustion pressing down on him like an invisible force. His body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. If he stopped, she wouldn't make it. Maybe he wouldn't either. The storm was merciless, a white abyss stretching endlessly in every direction. The streets had vanished beneath the thick snowdrifts, the buildings reduced to blurry shapes through the swirling frost. The world itself had become an endless void of ice and wind, and yet, somewhere within it, there had to be hope. There had to be safety. His golden fur, once thick and warm, was now stiff with ice, crusted over with frost that clung to him like a second skin. His ears, usually perked and alert, drooped under the weight of the snow gathering on them. His tiny paws, never meant for such brutal conditions, burned with every step, the ice cutting into the delicate pads. Hunger clawed at his stomach, a deep, gnawing ache that had grown unbearable, but he ignored it. His own suffering didn't matter right now. Only the kitten did. Her tiny, unmoving body swayed slightly as he trudged through the knee-deep snow, his jaws tightening instinctively to hold her secure. Every now and then, a flicker of fear rose in his chest. Was she still breathing? He couldn't stop to check. If he stopped, even for a moment, the cold would take them both. His legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath him, but he forced himself to keep going. One step, then another, and another. The snow was relentless, wrapping around his legs like invisible hands trying to pull him down, trying to bury him in its cold embrace. The wind howled through the abandoned city, rattling against old signs, bending tree branches until they cracked and broke. The storm had swallowed everything, even the sounds of the world. No birds, no distant voices, no footsteps but his own. Still, he pushed forward. His breath came in short, ragged puffs, each one visible for only a second before vanishing into the cold. His body felt heavier with each step, exhaustion creeping up his limbs like vines threatening to drag him down. Sleep, the thought whispered in the back of his mind. Just lie down. Just close your eyes. Just for a minute. The idea was tempting, so painfully tempting. But the kitten was still there, still clutched in his jaws, still depending on him. Somewhere ahead, through the blinding curtain of snow, there had to be shelter. There had to be warmth. But where? The city had turned into an endless maze of ice and white, every path blending into the next, every direction just as hopeless as the last. His vision blurred, exhaustion making the edges of the world hazy. He shook his head, trying to focus, but the storm was everywhere, surrounding him, whispering to him, lulling him into a daze. His paws dragged against the frozen ground, each step harder than the last. He couldn't do this. He wasn't strong enough. Then, through the suffocating white, something flickered. A light. His ears perked up, his breath hitching. At first, he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the storm, but then he saw it again, a faint, golden glow in the distance, flickering like a candle against the darkness. His heart leaped, a burst of desperate hope surging through his tired limbs. A house, warmth, shelter, safety. The thought sent a new wave of energy through his body. He lurched forward, legs trembling but determined. The kitten swayed with the motion, still limp, still silent. He couldn't think about that. Not yet. First, he had to get her there. The wind pushed against him, as if the storm itself was trying to stop him. He lowered his head, ears flattened against the howling gusts, and forced his way forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, his paws sinking into the snow, the cold biting into his bones. But the light was still there, shining like a beacon through the storm. One step, then another, and another. The closer he got, the clearer the house became. It was small, its roof weighed down by layers of thick snow, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth inside. A porch light flickered, barely visible against the blizzard, but bright enough to guide him toward it. He could almost feel the warmth already. His body ached for it, every frozen muscle screaming for relief. He just had to keep going, just a little further. The last few feet felt impossible. His legs barely moved, his paws dragging against the icy ground. But the house was right there. Then, just as he reached the steps, his legs gave out. He collapsed into the snow, the kitten slipping from his jaws, landing softly beside him. He gasped for air, his breath coming in weak, shuddering puffs. The cold wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, pulling him down, whispering that he could rest now. But he wasn't done. With one final burst of strength, he lifted his head and let out a small, weak bark. Then another, and another. The sound barely rose above the howling wind. But inside the house, someone heard. Inside the small wooden house, nestled between towering snowdrifts, an old man sat by the fire. The storm had raged on for what felt like forever, howling through the night, rattling the shutters, and burying the world outside under a thick, merciless layer of ice. He sighed, rubbing his aching hands together, feeling the warmth of the flames seep into his tired bones. For days, the city had been swallowed by the blizzard. The streets were deserted, the power lines frozen stiff, and the world beyond his porch had become a barren wasteland of white. It reminded him of winters long past, the kind that tested a man's endurance, the kind that had taken as much as they had given. He had seen storms like this before, and he knew what they left behind. He reached for the kettle, pouring himself another cup of tea, the steam curling upward like a whisper of warmth against the cold. The fire crackled softly, the only sound inside the house apart from the steady tick of the old clock on the wall. The storm had made the world outside silent. Still, nothing could survive out there. And then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost thought he imagined it. A bark, weak, desperate. The old man froze, his grip tightening around the mug. He turned his head toward the door, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind, relentless as ever, battering against the walls. But then, another bark, softer this time, barely audible, but it was there. His heart clenched. It wasn't just the wind playing tricks on him. Something or someone was out there. Setting his mug down, he pushed himself to his feet, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. He shuffled toward the door, his old joints protesting with every step. A part of him hesitated. Opening the door in a storm like this was foolish. The cold would rush in, and the wind would carry the snow straight into the house. But then he heard it again. A final, desperate whimper. That was enough. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind hit him instantly, a violent gust that stole the breath from his lungs. Snow swirled into the house, coating the floor in seconds, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were locked on the small shape on his doorstep. A puppy, barely more than a bundle of golden fur, curled up against the cold, trembling so violently he looked ready to collapse. His eyes were half-lidded, exhaustion dulling them, and yet there was something else, something fierce, still burning within them. But it wasn't just the puppy. Clutched gently in his tiny, ice-crusted jaws was something even smaller. Kitten. A frail, unmoving little thing. Its body limp, its fur soaked and frozen stiff. The old man's heart ached at the sight. He had seen many things in his long years, but this was something else. A puppy. Kitten. Alone in the storm, barely clinging to life, and yet somehow still here. The puppy lifted his head weakly, his body swaying from the effort. His tail barely twitched, a pathetic attempt at a wag. His message was clear. Please, help her. The old man knelt, his knees protesting as he reached out with careful hands. He took the kitten first, his fingers brushing against fur as cold as ice. No movement, no sound. His chest tightened. Then, just as he was about to pull back, he felt it. Faint breath. Shallow. Weak. But there. Alive. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he turned to the puppy, who was still staring at him, barely holding himself up. The poor thing looked seconds away from collapsing. Come here, boy, the old man murmured, his voice rough from years of silence but gentle nonetheless. He reached out, expecting the puppy to resist. Instead, the little dog did something that broke him completely. The moment the old man's hands touched him, the puppy let go. Not just of the kitten, but of everything. His legs gave out. His body slumped forward, and he collapsed against the man's chest, too weak to hold himself up any longer. The old man caught him, cradling both creatures in his arms, feeling the slow rise and fall of their fragile bodies. They were so small, so impossibly light, and yet, somehow they had made it through the storm. Somehow they had found him. Shaking off the cold, he pulled them close and stepped back inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The storm roared on outside, but inside, for the first time in days, there was warmth. The old man moved swiftly, his stiff joints forgotten in the urgency of the moment. He shut the door against the raging storm, sealing out the bitter wind that had nearly claimed the two fragile creatures now cradled in his arms. Snow clung to his boots, melting into small puddles on the wooden floor, but he ignored it. His focus was on the tiny, shivering bodies pressed against his chest, one a trembling bundle of golden fur, the other a frozen scrap of gray barely clinging to life. He crossed the small room in hurried steps, lowering them gently onto a thick pile of blankets near the fireplace. The warmth of the fire crackled invitingly, a stark contrast to the icy world outside. He wasted no time, wrapping another soft blanket around their tiny forms, tucking them in as if they were the most fragile things in the world. The puppy let out a weak whimper, his small body still shaking from exhaustion and cold. His golden fur was damp with melted snow, his tiny paws caked with frost, but he barely moved. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, flickered open for just a moment, just long enough to see the kitten beside him. The kitten, for her part, did not move. The old man's chest tightened as he reached out, pressing two fingers gently against her fragile side. For one agonizing moment, he feared he was too late, that the storm had stolen her last breath before he could save her. But then, faint rise, a shallow, barely there movement of her tiny chest. A breath. He exhaled, not realizing until that moment that he had been holding his own breath. The kitten was alive, weak, cold, but alive. Come on, little one, he murmured, his voice hoarse from years of solitude. You've made it this far. Don't give up now. The fire flickered, casting a golden glow over the room. He moved quickly, gathering an old towel, gently rubbing the dampness from the puppy's fur before doing the same for the kitten. The little cat didn't react, her body limp in his hands. But the puppy, he let out the faintest sigh, his muscles relaxing under the warmth. The old man smiled faintly. That's it, boy. Just rest. He disappeared for a moment into the kitchen, filling a small bowl with warm milk. He didn't know if the kitten would be strong enough to drink, but he had to try. He grabbed another bowl, filling it with water for the puppy. By the time he returned, the golden-furred pup had curled himself around the kitten, his body pressing close to hers as if trying to share whatever warmth he had left. It was an instinctive gesture, one that made something deep in the old man's chest ache. Even in his weakened state, the puppy was still protecting her. He set the bowls down, dipping his fingers into the milk and gently touching them to the kitten's lips. At first, there was no response. But after a few moments, the tiniest flicker of movement. A small, barely noticeable flick of her tongue. Hope stirred inside him. "There you go," he whispered. "That's it, little one." The puppy stirred slightly, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the water. His small pink tongue flicked out, lapping at the liquid hesitantly. The old man nudged the bowl closer. "Drink up, boy. You need your strength." Slowly, weakly, the puppy obeyed. For a long while, the only sound in the cabin was the steady crackling of the fire, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the two animals. Then, after what felt like forever, the kitten moved. A twitch at first, the smallest shift of a paw beneath the heavy blanket. Then a breath, deeper this time, stronger. Her ears flicked, her tiny nose scrunching as she let out a soft, barely audible meow. The old man felt his throat tighten. The puppy lifted his head at the sound, his ears perking up despite his exhaustion. He let out a soft whine, his tail giving a weak but unmistakable wag. She was alive. She was coming back. The old man watched as the kitten stirred, her body trembling slightly as she adjusted to the warmth. Slowly, as if every motion was a monumental effort, she opened her eyes. Two tiny, blue orbs blinked up at him, dazed and unfocused. Then, before she could react further, the puppy pressed his nose against her fur, a soft whimper escaping his throat. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, something more than survival. It was devotion. The kitten, weak as she was, responded in the only way she could. She let out a small, tired purr and nestled closer to him. The old man leaned back, exhaling deeply. He had lived many years, seen many things. But this bond between two creatures who had no reason to still be alive, this was something special, something rare, something that even the fiercest storm could not break. The fire crackled on, chasing away the last remnants of cold. Outside, the blizzard raged, the wind howling against the cabin walls. But inside, for the first time in a long while, there was warmth. And more than that, there was hope. The old man sat back, watching as the two tiny creatures, bound by something far stronger than instinct, drifted into sleep. Safe, warm, together, a new beginning. Days passed after the storm, and the old man watched as the puppy and kitten grew inseparable. Their bond seemed to form naturally, an effortless connection neither of them could deny. What had started as a chance encounter, two abandoned animals brought together by the unpredictable forces of nature, had blossomed into something extraordinary. The old man could hardly believe the change that had occurred in the days following the storm. What had once been a quiet, solitary home filled only with the echoes of his own thoughts, now buzzed with life. The sound of playful barking and the soft, melodic purring of the kitten filled the air, bringing a sense of comfort and joy that had been missing for years. The puppy, a small golden retriever mix, was the first to show any signs of affection toward the kitten. It had been a difficult beginning. The old man remembered the look on the puppy's face when it first encountered the kitten, a mix of confusion and curiosity. The kitten, with its tiny frame and wide, terrified eyes, had been just as wary. But there was an undeniable spark of something. Perhaps it was instinct or maybe just the sheer loneliness they both shared that brought them together. They began by cautiously sharing the same space, avoiding each other's touch while the old man kept a careful eye on them. It wasn't long before their wariness melted away. The puppy's boundless energy was a magnet for the kitten's more reserved nature. The kitten began to imitate the puppy's playful antics, even rolling around and batting at the puppy's ears with a mischief only a kitten could bring. The puppy, in turn, began to understand the kitten's more subtle ways of playing, nipping gently at the kitten's tail, or softly pawing at the kitten's tiny paws when it was feeling too tired to chase. In the mornings, the puppy would nudge the kitten awake with its soft, wet nose, The kitten would stir, stretching its little body and yawning, before immediately leaping out of the old man's lap to follow the puppy as it darted around the room. The old man smiled at the sight, a peaceful joy filling him as he watched them. It was a scene that he had not seen in so long, a feeling of home, of togetherness, of life and laughter filling the space. They spent their days together. The puppy and kitten played in the yard, chasing one another in circles, rolling through the grass, and occasionally getting tangled up in the old man's garden, causing him to chuckle as they tumbled over each other in their little adventures. The old man had never been much of a gardener, but now, his garden bloomed with vibrant flowers and lush plants. It was a peaceful place, one he loved to watch the animals explore. It was his little sanctuary, and now it was theirs too. The puppy was quick to learn the rhythm of the old man's days. It would follow him around the house, wagging its tail, its tiny paws tapping on the hardwood floors. The kitten, though more independent, would often curl up in a cozy corner of the living room, watching the puppy with half-closed eyes. Occasionally, the kitten would get up and stalk the puppy playfully, nudging its tiny head into the puppy's side before darting off in another direction. It was a silent game, a constant back and forth, one that never seemed to end. As the days passed, the bond between the two deepened. The old man could see it in the way they looked at each other. They had become more than just roommates. They were companions. They communicated through small gestures, a nuzzle, a playful nudge, a shared look of understanding. The old man marveled at how quickly they had adapted to each other. It was as if they had always known one another, as if fate had brought them together to fill a void neither of them could fully articulate. They ate together, their little bowls side by side. The puppy, though always a little bit more ravenous, would wait patiently for the kitten to finish before nudging its own bowl forward. The kitten, in turn, would occasionally nudge the puppy's bowl, as if offering a little bit of its meal in return. They shared everything: food, toys, and most importantly, space. The puppy and kitten had created their own little world, a world where everything made sense, where they didn't have to be afraid, where they could simply be. The old man watched it all, his heart swelling with affection for the animals. They had brought something back into his life that he thought he had lost forever. He had always been a solitary man, one who had never minded the silence that filled his home. But now, he understood the value of companionship. He understood the comfort of another living being by his side, whether it was the soft purring of the kitten or the excited barking of the puppy. There was something special about it, something that had brought warmth to his home in a way he never expected. But it wasn't just the old man who had found comfort in this unlikely pair. The puppy and kitten had also found something precious in each other. It was more than just a friendship, it was a kind of family. The storm had taken so much from them both, but it had also given them something incredible: each other. At night, they slept together, curled up in a small bed by the fireplace. The kitten would nestle against the puppy's side, its soft fur blending with the warmth of the puppy's body. The puppy, in turn, would stretch out protectively around the kitten, its body a gentle, warm cocoon. The old man would watch them sleep, his heart full. He no longer felt the weight of his loneliness. In the quiet moments when the house was still, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that these two animals had come into his life for a reason. There were nights when the old man would sit by the fire and listen to the crackle of the wood burning, the soft sighs of the animals as they slept. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that life could still be beautiful, even after all that had been lost. He thought about the storm, the winds, the rain, the destruction. He thought about how it had left him feeling hollow, unsure of what was left. But then, he had heard a soft meow at the door, and everything had changed. It had been the beginning of a new chapter. The storm may have taken much, but it had also brought him something far more precious than he could have ever expected: a new family. He no longer woke to the silence that had once suffocated him. Instead, he woke to the sound of paws on the floor and soft meows in the distance. The house was full once again, not with people, but with life in its purest form. Animals who had learned to depend on each other, and a man who had learned to depend on them too. Together, they had found a new kind of peace, one that was built on love, trust, and the simple beauty of companionship. The old man often thought about the journey they had all taken. The puppy and kitten had started as strangers to him, just two animals who had needed a home. But now they were his family. They had helped him heal in ways he could never have anticipated. Their love for one another had taught him something important, about connection, about the power of vulnerability, and about the beauty of starting over. He had been given another chance at life, and it was a chance he was determined to cherish. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the bond between the old man, the puppy, and the kitten grew deeper. They became inseparable, their routines intertwined, their lives woven together by fate, by the storm, and by the love they had for one another. They may have been an unlikely family, but they were family all the same. In the end, the old man realized that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. The storm had taken much from him, but it had also given him everything he needed: a home filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of companionship. Together, they were whole again. Did this story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible journey of survival and connection. And don't forget to hit that like button, share with friends who need a little inspiration, and subscribe for more heartwarming survival stories that will leave you feeling inspired. Stay tuned for more.